You know, when we think about influence, we may think of a motivational quote. We might think of a book or a specific character, a public figure that motivates us, or maybe even a music genre or a favorite movie that motivates you. But there are other forms of motivation. Besides emotional factors like I had discussed in the last module, there are other physical forms of influence. And I'll give you an easy example. Have you ever been driving on the road or maybe even on the freeway and all of a sudden you spot law enforcement? Like you might see a cop or let's say a highway patrol or a sheriff, and they drive or they're within the vicinity or at least within your scope of vision, and immediately you're influenced to check your speed, sit up straight, right? Put both hands on the wheel sometimes, or just make sure you're driving safe. You're not tailgating, you're not speeding. And the reason for that is because you're influenced to act a certain way out of fear of the consequence of not acting the correct way. And so there are other influences that we can all relate on. Like when we were kids, we were heavily influenced by authoritative figures, which basically were adults. Whether the adults were teachers, whether the adults were the principal, whether the adults were your parents or the parents of your friends, these were influential factors, right? They influenced us to behave, they influenced us to listen, they influenced us to do several other things. Whereas now as adults, we have other physical influences. It could be our spouse, it could be our kids. They influence us to be better people and better than we were before in order for them to learn how to be proper. Or we can be influenced by our spouse because we don't want to let them down. They love us, we care for them. You know, there's certain things that really just motivate us and influence us to do the things that we do. And so this concept still applies. It applies every day. It applies not only to ourselves, but also our prospects. And that's what I want to cover with you in this module is the actual influence and how to be an influence and how to discover who is the influencer. And so with prospects, you have to really find out the role of the person you're speaking to. Most commonly, when we deal with homeowners, typically there is a spouse involved or we're talking to a spouse. And even when we're not talking to a spouse, let's say we're talking to someone who's not married, they can still have a physical influence from maybe a fiance or a girlfriend or boyfriend, or maybe they can be influenced by their CPA or their attorney or their dad or their mom or someone, a physical influence. This is not a book or a YouTube video. This is someone who is physically in their world and they're influenced by them because that's kind of their consultant, right? It's their reference point, if you will. And the reason why that becomes their influence is because that's something that they have trust in. They have trust in that person. They feel safe in giving that person, kind of using that person as a consultant. And so influence plays a role now with prospects, and we have to find out who that influential role is because ultimately that's who we're going to communicate and actually sell to. So when you talk to homeowners who are married, for example, typically in the sales conversation or even sometimes throughout the process, you're really only dealing with one of the spouses. So you might be dealing, in this case, for example, Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones is the person who initiated the sales conversation. Mrs. Jones is the one who did the call to your company and now landed on your dialer, or they landed on your phone, and now you're talking to Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones is going to give away certain clues that she is just the influencer, she is not the decision maker. Again, Mrs. Jones could be saying words like, well, we need to look at this information, or we will make a decision, or we need to shop around, right? Or we don't like this from that company, so we want to see what you have. It's the key word, we. Now I can sense that Mrs. Jones is the influencer, but how do I respond to that? Do I kind of discredit Mrs. Jones and say, oh, well, she's not even the one to make the decision. Why am I going to give Mrs. Jones the time? Put the decision maker on the phone. Well, in reality, how you should treat Mrs. Jones is your key player in that process. So meaning that even if you don't sell on the first attempt to make that pitch, it's Mrs. Jones who's going to talk to the decision maker, Mr. Jones, when you're off the phone. It's Mrs. Jones who's going to say, hey, you know what? I know we chose not to buy right now, but Daniel really did a great job on communicating the benefits. Daniel did a really great job on discovering my deeper why. Daniel did a real great job on outlining a solution that's going to show us how to pay off this $10,000 in credit card debt and move $500 back into our savings account because we're not spending so much. Daniel really laid out a plan on how we can improve our FICO and help us retire in 7 years. Daniel said these certain words that all these other sales agents didn't say. I really like Daniel. What do you think the decision maker, Mr. Jones, is going to say? Well, then let's go with Daniel, right? That is an effective sale, but it's all because you're speaking to the influencer. And typically the influencer is the person who screens the call. What I've also found out is the influencer typically is the one who handles the finances at the end of the day. And so there are key statements or key words that they're going to use where, not only do you have to listen to, but you have to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, right? So Mrs. Jones said, well, we are looking to create monthly savings. Then I'll know that there are two people involved. And so when the sales pitch and the presentation comes about, I am certain that I'm doing everything I can to make sure that Mr. Jones or the decision maker is part of that presentation. And they don't have to be in the same location, right? They don't have to be in the same room. You don't have to be on speakerphone, although that's best and that's easy. You always have the ability to conference call Mr. Jones at work or while he is en route home and Mrs. Jones is at home. You can just conference call them both and put them both on the same line. I've closed many sales that way, and it's easier that way too, because if you pitch Mrs. Jones, and even though Mrs. Jones, you got a great rapport with Mrs. Jones has not done what you've done for as long as you've done, meaning she's not as privy or as aware of certain features or certain benefits or certain program details that you went over with her on that pitch, and the likelihood of Mrs. Jones explaining it as well as you do, or remembering everything as well as you do, or being able to answer questions as well as you can when she goes over that information with Mr. Jones. So not only are you making sure that the decision maker is there, or both parties are there, but you're ensuring that you're not wasting your time and ultimately having to pitch the same household twice on the same product, the same benefit. Because that pitch, again, can last like 30 to 45 minutes. So being efficient there and nipping it in the bud, if you will, all while you can at once is probably the best route to go. So consider that on any pitches you make. Always, always, always try to make sure that both parties are there and present on the phone, if not on a conference call, at the dining room table together with you on the speakerphone and a notepad next to you. Very efficient way to present and pitch your product. But going back to the role in bill paying. So the influencer will more than likely be the person who's in charge of the finances. But how do you ask that? How do you find that question out? What I do is I like to ask this. I say, with regards to monthly expenses, are you the one sending the bills out? Like when the bills are due, are you the one who goes through and sends out the bill pay? And the reason why I'm asking is because I need to know the amount that's being covered with his debt. And so kind of just basically just straightforward, right? And so, or sometimes I'll say, hey, Mrs. Jones, are you or is Mr. Jones the one who sends the payment out every month? Who's in charge of the ledger? And when you say ledger, they kind of get an idea of like, oh, okay, this is basically what comes in, what comes out, right? And the reason why it's important to figure out who is the one who handles the ledger or the family expenses is because they are the one with the most emotional tie to the outcome of your product, meaning they understand the numbers, whereas the decision maker could just be the one playing the back role. Like they're not concerned about the details. The decision maker probably has no idea how much they spend total each month. The decision maker is just the one who kind of has the authority, right? But the decision influencer, let's say it's Mrs. Jones, she's the one who sends out the bills. Mrs. Jones is the one that knows how much goes towards that $10,000 in credit card debt. Mrs. Jones is the one who knows of the help that's much needed in order to maintain the lifestyle. Mrs. Jones is the one who knows how much of that net income is left at the end of every month going into the next, whether it's zero, whether it's a couple hundred, whether it's a negative number. Mrs. Jones knows the importance and knows the urgency required in order to gain that benefit. And so that's the power of speaking with someone who handles the finances at the end of each month or when bills come and being are paid. Now, sometimes your prospects might say, oh, well, we both handle the bills, or we both do the bills at the end of the month. So that's even more reason as to why both should be present at the time of pitching your sale or presenting your product. In rare cases, you're going to find households that keep the checking and savings separate, or Mr. and Mrs. Jones have different bank accounts and they kind of just divvy up everything at the end of the month. And so a way to go about that is understanding how much each contributes, right? So Mrs. Jones could be making $50,000 per year, whereas Mr. Jones makes $100,000 per year. So what is Mr. Jones' contribution? So if I found out that Mr. Jones is just responsible for the mortgage and let's say the homeowner's insurance and taxes, and that's it, Mr. Jones covers everything else, then I'm going to really start speaking to Mr. Jones, right? And say, hey, I know you guys want to create cash flow, Mr. Jones, but what would you do with the monthly savings, since I know it's Mr. Jones' responsibility? And if I find out Mr. Jones says, oh, I just don't want to spend any extra money because I'm trying to buy a boat, right? Or I'm trying to buy a vacation home in Arizona because Mr. Jones loves the river. So now I'm changing my approach, right? So now I'm really speaking to Mr. Jones, even though Mrs. Jones is a screener. Mrs. Jones doesn't have the emotional tie to that monthly savings. Mr. Jones does. Mr. Jones' responsibility is the mortgage, but Mr. Jones doesn't have time to screen all the salesmen about his debt. So Mrs. Jones is doing a favor, doing him a solid, and interviewing all the salesmen. But I know exactly where to focus my time, and it's not on selling Mrs. Jones about the lowest rate and the lowest fee. It's about selling Mr. Jones on a solution to create more cash flow so he can buy his river home. So Mr. Jones can go buy his boat. Mr. Jones can do these things that Mr. Jones just can't do right now because he's the one responsible for that entire mortgage debt. So that's the power of influence. And when you figure out that this concept applies with your prospects, you also figure out how it applies with yourself. And so what influences you? Is it your sales manager? Is it your friends? Is it the dramatic person at the end of your aisle who always goes, Monday? You got to find out who influences you. And sometimes it could be the COO or CEO of your company. Like, you watch from afar and they influence you in a way where you just are constantly thinking, like, how do I get to that level? How do I get to that level? Wherever you are, wherever you find influence from, understand where it's coming from and why your decisions are being made the way they're being made now.